In 1978, the North Vietnamese army deposed Pol Pot in a matter of a week. But for 19 years afterwards, he and his supporters lived in the forests, continuing to kill, continuing to foment war, and continuing to make the lives of ordinary Cambodian people worse. There was no chance that Pol Pot would ever retake Cambodia. But in an environment where he believed that he might be strung up from a lamppost if he gave up, in an environment where an international tribunal might have put him in prison for the rest of his life if he gave up, he did keep fighting. We don't want those Cambodian people to die. We don't want the next Cambodia to have to go for 20 years after a dictator has been deposed without having that justice. And so what we want to do is to create a situation where dictators can give up their power either when they are in power or when they are still fighting in civil wars and be put up somewhere without being convicted of crimes in order to stop those wars from going on. How do we want that to happen? There'll be a number of conditions on our model. These dictators will be allowed to have this immunity from prosecution under a number of circumstances. Firstly, they have to provide us with information about what their regime did. We want to know where the graves are. We want to know who the murders were committed by. We want to know exactly what happened. Secondly, we think they should publicly admit to their guilt and publicly admit to the wrongs that they've done. Thirdly, we think if at all possible, before they do step down, they should allow peacekeepers to enter their country. Fourthly, we think they should make statements indicating that they have voluntarily left the leadership. Fifthly, they should be gagged from ever saying anything about what's going on in the politics of their country or participating in the politics of their country. And sixthly, they'll be exiled. We think they should be put up in relative comfort in order to induce them. We're happy for them to keep some of their personal wealth. We're happy to give them some sort of personal wealth. We think they can be put up in a variety of places. Elba is one which has been used in the past. Why do we want to do this? I'm going to talk about three things. Firstly, why on principle this is best. Secondly, why we think they'll take this. And thirdly, why the personal importance of dictators means this will make politics better in these countries. Firstly, on principle, this team hates the idea of dictators not being convicted of crimes. We hate it. But we hate the idea of people being murdered, of people being butchered in the forests of Cambodia, of people being butchered by the Lord's Resistance Army in situations where they don't need to be. So our idea of justice is to say this, that although retrospective justice is important, that prospective justice for people who need not die is significantly more important. Secondly, what we'd say is that the most important form of justice for people who have been victims of this regime isn't justice by revenge, but restorative justice, which allows them to get the closure from knowing precisely what happened to their families, from knowing that the crimes were committed, and from knowing that people have admitted to their guilt. But the third thing that we'd say is that the reality that these teams will have to deal with is that for the most part, the justice that we seek never happens. That either these dictators stay in power for years because they control the mechanisms of power, or they keep fighting. They go to the forest and they maintain civil wars that go on for decades. But what's more, that when justice does come, it is almost never in the form of the ICC, it's in the form of a coup in which the new leader strings them up by a lamppost, doesn't have a real trial, and creates victor's justice that only exacerbates the tensions that exist in that country and doesn't give real results from that justice. So we say two things about justice. The first is that we're prepared to say that it's prospective and not retrospective, and the second is to say that anything is better than nothing. Go ahead, Nicole.
Pol Pot was possessed by an ideology that still continued after he was removed. Does this not incentivise indirect influence and funding of other campaigns that maintain that ideology in these countries?
Nicole, it's just not true. I mean, like, Pol Pot died in 1997 and the war ended there. That is just not true. Like, I will not answer the rest of that question because it is not true. Secondly, why do we think these dictators will take this? First, like, there are three incentives that we think drive dictators to stay in power. The first of those is that many of them are kleptocrats who use their positions of power to rob their people and to feather their own beds, and their personal wealth is most important to them. The second of those is that many of them suspect, given the impressions of fear and murder that they've created, that their people will kill them, will string them up by lampposts, will depose them in violent coups if they don't maintain power. And the third is that many of them believe that if they don't maintain power, that diplomatic immunity that they have will go away and that they will be taken up by international tribunals, by ad hoc tribunals, as has happened in many countries. What we are doing is creating a circumstance in which those incentives, rather than driving them to do what they do now, which is hang on to power as much as possible or keep fighting in civil wars, drive them towards leaving power as the safest option. Why? Because in the status quo, maintaining power means that you can get money and get a comfortable circumstance. Under our model, the most comfort that you are likely to get is from going into exile in a comfortable, safe Western country where you don't have those dangers. Under the status quo, I'll take you in 1 second, the motivation that you have if you're afraid of your people is to stay in power, because power is the best guarantee. Under our model, you're far away from any possibility of those people being able to kill you or depose you and kill you as they are under the status quo. Go ahead.
You're basically talking about rewarding these people for doing crimes, right? You're talking about making their lives comfortable so that they don't feel the need to continue committing these crimes. It's ridiculous.
We're not rewarding them for committing crimes, we're accepting reality. If you are, by the way, suggesting that dictators would commit crimes in order to be allowed to have this, we would say we're prepared to give this to the not as bad ones as well in order to do this. The second thing that we'd say is that given that there are like such a raft of circumstances around this, and given that we'd say the possibility that your people won't murder you first isn't 100%, there are still pretty firm incentives not to be an awful dictator. The other thing that we'd say is that we know from history that these people who do have these murderous regimes are thankfully rare. So we create incentives that allow you to do all of the things that you want to do without having to stay in power and without having to keep fighting. And let's remember that many of these people are fighting in hopeless civil wars that continue for decades after any power for them is possible and have no reason to do so except to keep themselves from being killed or put in prison. But third, why will this make the situation better in these countries? It's because of the personal importance of these people. Firstly, many dictators have personal evils that are worse than anyone else could be. But even no one else but Pol Pot could have conceived of the Year Zero plan and murdered 2 million of his own people. We think no one else but Mao could have conceived of his organisation of the Cultural Revolution and the fact that once he died, China changed so radically bears our opinion out. Secondly, much of the support for these people is personal, and many people stop fighting once that personal figurehead is gone, which is what happened in Congo when many of the Lumumba supporters stopped fighting their war during the first civil war and stopped millions of people from dying once that person was gone. You're well out of order. But thirdly, much of the fear of these people is personal. There's a reason Idi Amin cut people's limbs off and sewed them back. It's not because it helped him, it's because it made people fear him personally. And resistant groups won't fight against people that they regard as monsters and regard as devils, but they will fight against people who are unstable in new situations, even if the only result of that model is to create a new regime in its place. But we think it's likely that the regimes we get will be better than any other deposition, because firstly we avoid the stab in the back myth from these people by forcing them to voluntarily give up power, but secondly make it less likely that there'll be a palace coup in which a new leader will have to forge their own legitimacy by being more murderous and more brutal and more feared. Ladies and gentlemen, we want justice, but the most important justice we want is for people who could live lives that they won't if these people keep in power and keep fighting. This important motion must stand.